with the flying.
You should be careful. Okay. Welcome to the SARE for Senate New York Symposium on this Friday, January 20th. I'm Diane Sayre, a LaRouche independent candidate running for U.S. Senate in 2024. That is the seat held currently by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. And we're going to be talking tonight about why the British Empire fears China. And I can report there was a discussion in the LaRouche movement this past Monday with Helga Zepp LaRouche on the question of China and, frankly, the great underestimation of the significance of China's having lifted 850 million people out of poverty over the last 40 years, how that has changed the entire world, the demographics of the world, and the potential of the world. And I think should go a ways to answer a question which someone asked me the other night as we were discussing the increasingly intense and insane push toward thermonuclear war with Russia, or now also with China. The person was saying, why are they so desperate? Who would want to keep provoking and ignoring the the red lines of heads of state of major nuclear superpowers. And this gives an indication of the reason for the desperation, that there is an entirely new paradigm coming into existence. It is very much along the lines of what Lyndon LaRouche fought for going back to at least 1976, his proposal for an international development bank. And I would say really his commitment, since he was a veteran serving in World War II under Franklin Roosevelt, who died before the war ended, but who intended that at the end of the war, the British, Dutch, French, Belgians should liberate every single colony, that there should be no more nations under colonial rule. And not only that, but he was very conscious and said explicitly on numerous occasions to his son that if you don't eradicate poverty, if you insist on having a situation where some people are very rich and they're looting other people and other nations, then you are just laying the groundwork for another world war, and mankind can't afford that. Well, FDR died. LaRouche believed that the British deliberately prolonged the war to make sure that he would not be around. So the war officially ended on VE Day about a month, May 8th, 9th, a month after FDR died on April 12th. And Truman came in, made the decision to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan, even though that was unnecessary because the emperor was already negotiating terms of surrender through the Vatican, and has led, frankly, to the era where we now find ourselves, where enemies are created for the purpose of a political agenda, in this case, because the transatlantic system is thoroughly bankrupt. The City of London and Wall Street are presiding over a bubble of derivatives obligations of now at least $2 quadrillion that can never be paid. And you and I, the people of the United States and Western Europe, are being looted like an aphid milks an ant. We are being looted to pay for this, or worse. As a friend said, it's like a 400-pound tick on a 10-pound chihuahua. Both the tick and the chihuahua are in trouble at a certain point. You run out of whatever else you can loot. That's what we're facing. That's what's driving the desperation for war. And on that, I just want to report a couple of things. The New York Times had an article 2 days ago where they are basically proposing an insane proposal laid out by the Royal Institute of Strategic Studies, I think, in the UK, which basically said we should create something like a Cuban Missile Crisis, only worse, over Crimea. That we should back Ukraine in taking Crimea, trying to deliver a threat to Russia. The Russians, we might go to nuclear war over it, but we might not. And then we can use that as a bargaining chip. If Russia will end the invasion, they can keep Crimea, but they have to give back everything else. This whole crazy idea is a fallacy of composition. Crimea was given to Ukraine in 1954, which means you have people alive in Crimea today who were born as Russian citizens, became Ukrainian citizens, and then became Russian citizens again. They had a referendum after the coup that was run by the Obama-Biden administration in 2014 to leave Ukraine because you now had a Banderist pro-Nazi regime in Ukraine, which was killing people and torturing them for speaking Russian, etc. So therefore, the people of Crimea voted in a referendum, 96%, to leave Ukraine and rejoin the Russian Federation. The military base Sevastopol is located there, which has been a Russian base since about the time of Catherine the Great. There's just no way that it's even a credible threat that Ukraine is going to take Crimea, no matter how many weapons we give them. But it is a very good way to provoke an irrevocable consequence that is a nuclear war. And it should be taken to heart that the former president of Russia, Medvedev, who is now leader of the National Security Council, he said nuclear powers don't lose wars. So if it looked like Russia were losing a conventional war, then you probably would see a use of nuclear weapons if it were an existential threat. The issue of Ukraine, the proximity to Russia, the attacks on Russia, the explicit statements by President Biden and others that the purpose of the war is to destroy and weaken Russia means it is likely that Russia would see this as an existential threat, whereas loss of Ukraine or what happens in Ukraine is not an existential threat to the US or NATO, except that the US, UK, and NATO have made it an existential threat by saying that Russia cannot be allowed to win. And if Russia wins, it's a defeat for NATO. So that construct has been entirely created by the West, and it is extremely dangerous. The other, now, as people may have noticed, Biden and the Prime Minister of Japan signed some agreements where the US is saying we would use nuclear weapons to defend Japan, probably because of the recent elections in Taiwan. At least some people in Taiwan are wise enough to know they don't want to end up like Ukraine. So they don't seem to really have a stomach for being ground up in a proxy war against China. So the United States has to find someone else to provoke a war with China, or I should say the US, UK, NATO, this Great Reset Davos crew. So now they want Japan to help with that by trying to exacerbate conflicts over the Senkaku Islands or anything else they can come up with. And I just want to read you some comments from the American head of the Southern Command, a General Laura Richardson, from July of 2022 to give you a little bit of a sense of what is being said about China and perhaps why we're getting so much visceral anti-China pre-war propaganda in the United States. She said that, South America, she's talking about South America, because if we're going to have a war with China, it would be very complicating if nations in South America have a good relationship with China. So somehow that has to be busted up. So she is talking about the relationship between China and South America and the U.S. national security region's interest in these countries. Now, think about the American policy towards South America. What has it been? Well, start with our closest neighbor, which is, I guess, technically part of North America, Mexico. What did we do? We shipped guns down in this program called Fast and Furious, and we're supporting the drug cartels, and now we're legalizing drugs all over the country to make it more profitable for them to keep their business. Thanks to the American policy, the Mexican drug cartels often have more advanced weapons than the Mexican military. Might be a reason why people want to get out of the country. Similarly with Haiti, which is the Caribbean, but it's a very good example of using a country for drug trafficking. Look at Colombia, where the head of the New York Stock Exchange years ago went down to support the FARC. Look at various governments that we have been involved in overthrowing, what we did to Noriega in Panama, and what the British, the Falkland or Malvinas Islands, Argentina. So has our policy been to develop South America? No, it has not. It has been to loot it, to create unrest, to overthrow governments, to try and steal raw materials. We had two presidents who wanted very much to develop all of the Americas after Abraham Lincoln. That was Garfield and McKinley, both of whom were assassinated. So think about that. So here's General Laura Richardson, and she says of South America, quote, It's off the charts rich. 60% of the world's lithium is in the region. You have heavy crude, you have light sweet crude, you have rare earth elements, you have the Amazon, you have 31% of the world's fresh water here in this region. And there are adversaries taking advantage of this region every single day right in our neighborhood. Who are the adversaries? China and Russia. What are they doing? Building ports, nuclear power plants. Sorry, that's a snorting dog in the background. Building power plants, railroads, subway stations, has to be stopped. And she complains. She says 25 nations in South America have Chinese projects going on inside their countries. A metro station, a railway, a highway, a dam. We can't even build or maintain a dam in the United States, and we certainly don't want anyone else building them. So this is what they're upset about, that China is building these projects in South America. And she says that they're just doing this to try and gain access and to undermine the United States. Well, maybe they have another mission, but the United States, she's saying it's the policy of the United States to disrupt this. And how dare anyone talk about building dams and power plants and subway systems in nations. It's very ugly, very brutal. So the point is, we have to move into a new paradigm. We have to move into a paradigm which was indicated by the American Revolution against the British Empire, and which has been largely crushed since the assassination of President Kennedy. And with the two guests I have this evening, I think you will get a sense of why there is such an effort to demonize China, what they are afraid of, what China has actually done. I will say, as always, participation in my symposium doesn't constitute an endorsement of my candidacy. I may or may not agree with the views of everyone expressed here, but I think that they deserve to be heard. So I would like to introduce George Koo, who is a retired business consultant, who is a contributing writer to Asia Times, and who knows a great deal about both the United States and China. So George, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Diane. I'm about to roll a video that came to my attention about two and a half years ago. And it's an example of how the great length that China will go to alleviate poverty in some of the most difficult areas to reach. And I was asked by Diane to talk about how China has alleviated poverty in China. As she said, over 800 million, which is roughly 75% of all the poverty in the world that belong to China, that has been taken out of poverty. Very spectacular and important development. But before I say any more, let's take a look at the video. 我怎么做这些花？什么？人家家呀？哎呀，你那个鸡子。好了，这个，好的，这个。
Well, if you want an example of just how left behind some of China's poorest communities have become, there's probably none more striking than the village on top of this cliff. The options for government intervention are limited. In this case, it's come down to nothing more simple than this steel ladder.
一起上还是有点贵，一起7块钱、8块钱。球，这走的包括嘛，还走的养鱼，
I think we
其他什么
Jose, we
什
can
么
cut
东
it
西都没
off
有。
now.
The government says that
Thank you. Let's go on to my cover slide, Jose, and then I'm going to start my talk. There we go. Okay. So what I did after I saw that BBC video, I looked into a little bit more about the community, the what I call the life of the cliff dwellers. And what I found out was that these people live at about 3,000 feet elevation, and they've been there for over 800 years. You know, generations lived up there. And for the most time, it was the safest place to be. It was so high up, marauders and benders can't be bothered to pest with them. But after a national media took some pictures of how they were climbing up these highly risky, dangerous looking ladders made out of wood and bamboo, the local government promptly replaced it with a steel ladder. But even more important, they put that community on high priority to solve their abject poverty. And they, by the time I wrote that piece, they had been moved down to a community with very low cost housing, has running water, has kitchen, has refrigerator, and the kids no longer have to climb up and down that ladder to go to school. And because they're now connected by highway to the towns and markets, they can sell their goods much more easily. And so it's an example of a rather kind of extreme example, because not all of the really poor rural countries are so out of touch as this particular one. But I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to explain a little more, simply because there's so much misinformation about China. Anything and everything China does that is positive is always somehow negatively portrayed. Even that BBC clip, which I thought was relatively objective and fair, you can see they bring in the open fire kitchen, which I'm happy to report they're not using anymore. In fact, the whole operation up there on that cliff dwelling some of it has been converted into tourist attractions, because with all that publicity and all that climbing up on the steep ladder, it has become an appeal to tourism inside China. They kept some of the better parts of the farmland, and they're raising cash crops as opposed to just corn and potatoes. It's not very well understood that moving people out of poverty in China has been going on for probably since the economic reform in 1978. For the first phase or two, as China's economy grew rapidly, it just created more opportunities, more jobs, more income, and then it was helped by the urbanization, moving people from the rural area into nearby cities, so that starting from 1980, 1978, there may have been as many as 800 million below the poverty line. By 2012, there's only about 100 million below the poverty line. And in the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party, they moved poverty alleviation into as one of the top priorities. And then in 2016, Xi Jinping specifically had that written into the 13th five-year plan, which started from 2016 to 2020. At that point, rural folks in the below the poverty line are really very difficult to reach areas. Not all of them, mind you, are cliff dwellers, but there are some that are so remote they're not connected by roads, not connected by internet, and so on. And at the end of 2019, they did a count. They found that there were about 5.5 million in below the poverty line. And that's 5.5 million, according to the Chinese government report, was eliminated by 2020, which was the goal that they had set up at the Congress, the People's Congress previous to the one that we've had. I should say that the so-called poverty line is a moving goalpost. It may have been at one point $1.10 per person per day, and then they may have moved up to $2.30, or according to World Bank, up to $5.50 per person per day. It's a reflection of the economy of the country. As the economy expands and all the livelihoods improve, the poverty line also was raised. So the general approach to poverty alleviation, first of all, as I mentioned, it started out at a very low base because China was one of the poorest nations until Deng Xiaoping started the economic reform. But because of the very rapid economic growth and the agricultural productivity was greatly improved with the help of technology such as fertilizer, machinery, and the improved water distribution, the agricultural income actually improved significantly since from the 1978 and on. And then, of course, at the same time, the value-added labor, thanks to investments from Hong Kong and from Taiwan, that it improved the economics of China, and it created the phenomenon known as migrant workers that left the rural area to work in these factories. Then China figured out that if they urbanize and move people from the rural area, especially the excess rural workers, that will improve the livelihood and income for everybody concerned. Because those that left the farm, or I should say, those that remain on the farm, ends up with greater plots of land to work on, increases the economy of scale, and increases their income. The other impact that greatly improved the livelihood of people was after the financial crisis of 2008. Because while the financial crisis of 2008 put us in the deep hole in the West, Wall Street crisis, and so on, China did not go through this quantitative easing, which was to print more money. They actually invested in building infrastructure. So starting from 2008 on, you start to see the beginning of what became the world's largest network of high-speed rail, a great system of highways that's comparable to the interstate highway of the US. All that was happening, and that too improved the economics of the country. The life expectancy and infant mortality continued to improve along with it, as well as the percent of secondary school enrollment, so that by 2010, the enrollment in the secondary school was 88% in China. And that was much higher than other countries at higher GDP level than China was at that point. So on the average, since the economic reform started in 1978, around 18.7 million people were taken out of poverty on the average per year. And then when the booming 2000s came along and the national GDP was growing at a rate of 10% per year, then the number that came out of poverty was about 30 million per year. So by 2019, as I mentioned before, 5.5 or around 6 million rural poor still remain. So in a way, poverty reduction has always been part of the government plan, and this alleviation was all regularly reviewed to see how they're doing. So and then, as I mentioned, in 2016, when they wrote the 5-year program that finished in 2020, systematic poverty alleviation was part of the government platform, if you will. And that included such thing as social assistance, healthcare insurance, maternity coverage, unemployment insurance, and pension were given to those identified as below the poverty. Local governments were charged with monitoring and identifying rural areas down to individual households. Then the central government, along with the provincial government and the local government, they all contributed to anti-poverty funds to allocate to help these people out. And of course, as I mentioned, infrastructure, that meaning roads and rail, which eventually connected some of these remote rural areas to markets, which facilitate and enable them to earn a much improved income. When the internet gets to these areas, they now have national exposure for their local products. And some of these local products could be fairly exotic fruits that most Chinese haven't even heard of until the internet, and they become customers. The internet also promoted tourism because they become exotic locations for the Chinese tourists. And as you all know, tourism China is now the most important economic stimulus for all the recipient countries that receive them. The actual implementation of poverty alleviation are left to the local government, and there's no one solution solves all type of situation. It all depends on the local conditions. As I mentioned, not all of them are cliff dwellers in such an unusual condition of having to climb down a ladder every day. The local government is charged with finding employment and developing stable source of income for these people. They teach these poor business development skills and other skills, vocational training. And why do the local government are charged and are effective in doing this? Because the incentive for the local government officials and their promotion and their career track is dependent on how well they're doing, and they are measured by each level along the way measures the progress. So the local are measured by, say, county level, county level are measured by the provincial officials are measured by the central government. Another interesting approach is to pair rich coastal provinces with the poor interior provinces. Specifically, they will link a wealthy county. In one case, the county that was given was a county in Fujian province, which is on the coast, with Ningxia, which is a very dry, poor county province in the west. And how this linking works is that the rich county will transfer funds to the poor county, and then donations and from enterprises and social organizations also goes to the poor county. And then will send officials to exchange 6 from each county. The poor goes to the rich goes to the poor, and the poor officials go to rich to learn how to operate, how to administer, how to manage. And the rich officials go to the poor to make suggestions, to guide them on how they should improve their development. So these the help includes infrastructure building, including subsidies for the impoverished households and vocational training and so on. It also includes technical officials that will introduce certain technology to the local area. And usually, if these officials did a good job, at the end of their 2-year assignment, they frequently get a promotion. So in a way, you can say this very specific poverty alleviation that's been done for the last 4 years could be considered a domestic Belt and Road type of a program. And the important thing is that everybody buys into this program. And the one general rule and driver in this poverty reduction is employment. They have to figure out ways to create jobs for these people from these poor rural regions. Now, one example in that Ningxia county that I mentioned, a company in Fujian identified an opportunity to create a beef processing plant in Ningxia because cattle is being raised in Ningxia and also in the surrounding area, including, I think, Inner Mongolia. Well, this beef processing plant created 300 jobs for the local people. And of course, it created a market for the beef to the rest of the country. So I think the other part, the floor of this program, is to ensure those emerging from poverty to have some sort of a minimum guarantee and have social assistance. And they seem to be assured that they will receive the kind of assistance for at least a 5-year period so that they don't feel insecure, they don't feel feel the threat of having to return to poverty. I think Deng Xiaoping was well known for this quote, crossing the river by feeling the stones, and meaning that you sort of experiment as you go and trying to figure out what works and what does not work, and then adjust as it goes. And this is indeed what these local governments learn to do. So the 3 major components to this poverty alleviation that Xi Jinping put on top of the list are 3 major components. And I don't know how, maybe we can talk about this, how applicable this approach would be in the United States. First is a national government commitment. Xi Jinping declared eradication as a top priority for the 13th five-year plan from 2016 to 2020. This means finding and solving the last mile of poor household. Failure is not an option. And everybody understands and knows that. The second important option is that there are incentives at every level of the government to perform. And because they will be graded, and whether they get promoted or demoted, this is a very important component of their job performance. A third component is that there is a whole of government and society approach. That means that everybody buys into the process to induce and encourage cooperation across every government department. And that two-county from two-province collaboration is an example. Now, for those of you might be interested in knowing more and understanding all the details of this poverty alleviation and a review and description, I would recommend you can Google this and you'll find it. There's a booklet prepared by the World Bank in cooperation with the State Council of China. The title is called 4 Decades of Poverty Reduction in China. Now, let me make a couple more comments that I think distinguishes between how China goes about it and how we go about it in the United States. One of them, very obvious, is homeless people. You go to China, you go to cities many times bigger than San Francisco, Seattle, New York, Philadelphia, many times bigger, and you will not see homeless people sleeping on the street. Their system is whenever a homeless person shows up, the public safety officials will interview them, find out where they're from, contact their relatives from their hometown and village, and then after cleaning them up and giving them a meal, put them on a train and send them back to where they came from. Escort provided if necessary, depending on whether these people are mentally ill or otherwise. But they treat them with human dignity and respect, and they handle and deal with them every case as they encounter them. And I would suggest that this is very different from how we handle it here in this country. Okay, next slide, please. Last slide. Jose? No, not the first slide. Keep going. There we go. I thought you folks would be interested in seeing each one of those structure houses at least 100, 200, 300 families in each round structure. And when the U.S. satellites flew over, or the spy plane flew over in the 60s, they couldn't figure out what they were. They thought they were missile silos. But actually, these are called Hakka roundhouses. And it's a measure and an indication of the diversity of people living in China. It's very mountainous. And these Hakka people were actually not an ethnic minority like it was like the one in the cliff dwellers. These are ethnic Hans, but they migrated from the northern China to the southern China hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And when they appear as strangers in the new area, they're not welcomed. They run into hostile neighbors. So they built these roundhouses. The walls are about 10, I think 3 meters thick, mud and bamboo reinforced no openings on the first 2 ground floors, only one door, barricaded, guarded with hot oil and hot water so that no invaders can enter into these structures. And if you see the open area goes all the way to the courtyard down below, and they have their community meetings down there. They have their chickens and pigs in there. They have, all of them have a well with water to the groundwater, and every family occupies a pie section from the top floor to the ground floor. These are at least 3 to 4 floors buildings. They sleep on the top floor. They cook and do their daily living on the second floor. Cook on the first floor. Do their living on the second floor. They were not rich, but with the opening and economic development, when we visited them, next slide, please. That's my wife and I, and when we visited them, we found that they were doing great business. This is an area which China is famous for their tea, and they're drying tea and selling it not only to tourists, but also to shipping it out to other markets. But this gives, I just want to conclude and give you a flavor and a taste of what China is like today. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure that will provoke a lot of questions. And I'm glad you mentioned just this homeless situation, between the difference between China and here. And I'll stop because we're going to hear from Liam and then we'll open it up. But I'd like to introduce Liam Murphy, who, as people can see, is a young organizer who I first met last year during my campaign against Schumer. He and Zaira came up here to work to help with the campaign. He has now written his first of what will probably be many articles for Executive Intelligence Review. And what he was looking at is a project going on in Uganda and Tanzania. And I think he's going to tell us something about that and something about the role of China in Africa. So Liam, welcome and go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, Diane. It's quite the honor to be on your symposium and to be able to share it with you and Dr. Koo. So I am very appreciative to be able to speak with such an honored guest in you, Diane. And I think we're covering a very, very important subject here today. You know, Dr. Koo has said in an interview with Mike Billington that cooperation between the United States and China, if we don't see it, basically a catastrophe will ensure. The world depends on cooperation between Russia and China for the present and the future. And it is important that we take on this question of why is it that it seems that Atlantic power is seeming to really drive a hatred campaign and a misinformation campaign against China. And so that's what I wanted to take on today. And I think that for me to understand why the hatred towards China is occurring, I like to think of it through a metaphor. So I want you to imagine that you are the leader of a very large corporation or a company. And perhaps you joined this company when you were very young, or perhaps you even started it from the ground up. And through the years, you had to make various very important decisions in the life cycle of your company. And those decisions may or not have spelled out the continued growth of that company or the end of that company. And through the years, you might have had various consultants or people within your organization offer various different pathways to the company's future. And as a leader, there was many times where I'm sure you would have had to have made tough decisions on the direction forward for your company. I'd like to also have you imagine that you've been in this position for a very, very long time. you're starting to become an old man or an old woman, and a little bit of your intrepidity is maybe has been lost, and you're nearing maybe your final days in running this company. And perhaps you start hearing that there are young people within your organization or young managers who are thinking of ideas to push the company forward and thinking of new ideas on how to really grow and develop in a modern situation your company forward. And I want you to imagine that perhaps some of those ideas might be contrary to what your company has traditionally done or traditionally pursued, and some of them might even be directly contrary to what you have in mind. Now, in this case, I want you to think about what you would do as a leader in that scenario. Diane, as you are a future leader for the US Senate, these kind of thought experiments are important for you to think, but I think that anyone who is responsible and who has a good heart would, of course, be interested in hearing what new ideas that the younger people within their company are thinking of. And perhaps you might not agree with everything that the younger people within your organization are assuming is the direction forward, but I think a wise leader would, of course, take those ideas and perhaps feed into those ideas some practical wisdom and some of your experience and some of your understanding, so that the new direction forward for the company once you're gone can go in a positive direction. And the unfortunate reality is that not necessarily everyone is that great of a leader. The unfortunate reality is that many leaders are actually more concerned about maintaining their control over things or containing the way they want things to be, or preserving their legacy or preserving their name, rather than actually organizing their company on a direction that is fruitful forward into the future. And quite unfortunately, I think that this is a good metaphor for the global situation that we are in today. We have an Atlantic order that has been around for a long time and has a certain tendency that is quite destructive, and is, rather than seeking opportunities for new growth and new development, is trying to maintain something that has already decayed. And just like with a company that makes this type of mistake, that often companies who do not embrace changes after many, many years of success, they could suddenly collapse unexpectedly. I think that we are seeing the development of a similar phenomenon when we look at global affairs. And this is a huge danger. And this is kind of, I think, the battle that is occurring right now, which I wrote about in my article, between two tendencies. One is a sort of Zeusian tendency, which we see with the rules-based order and this very Malthusian net zero policy, versus the somewhat very Promethean type tendency that we are seeing emerge out of China and the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think there's no better way of really looking at that and seeing that dynamic and seeing this crisis point, but also this mega opportunity, than looking at the concrete examples of this that we're seeing, particularly in Africa, and even more so particularly in East Africa with the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, or EACOP. So for those of you who do not know of EACOP, EACOP, if constructed, will be the largest heated crude oil pipeline in world history. Now, EACOP begins in Uganda, which is a landlocked country under the British East Empire, or I forget which British company, but one of the British trading companies. Kenya and Uganda were separated, and Uganda became a landlocked country over the course of its history. And right now, in the Lake Albert region, there are oil fields, oil deposits that the Ugandans are interested in extracting from and bringing to export on the world market. And this pipeline goes from the western part of Uganda and down through Tanzania and to the coast, the Indian coast, the coast of Tanzania to the Indian Ocean. And this is, of course, something that is kind of symbolic of the overall change that we're seeing in the world, not just in Africa, but all over, of the kind of battle that we're seeing between this kind of Zeusian tendency and this Promethean tendency. Because right now in Uganda, 90% of Ugandans are actually still being, by necessity, are having to go and chop down trees for wood and charcoal so that they can heat their home and cook their food. Another example of this kind of undevelopment is that Ugandans often have to use, 80% of Ugandans have to use these Taduba paraffin wax candles to light their home. And there's been many instances and many examples of, say, a young university student who is having to study late at night to be able to prepare for an examination the next morning. And because they have used this candle and they're getting a little sleepy, they accidentally drop it on their mattress. And the mattress lights on fire, their whole home sets on fire, lives are often lost this way, and property is destroyed. And this is obviously a tragedy, and it demonstrates the influence that energy and energy poverty or abundance has on people's everyday lives. For instance, I think a really shocking comparison and the depravity of the situation is really demonstrated when you compare the United States per capita per year kilowatt hour consumption versus Uganda. So the United States has a per capita per year kilowatt hour consumption of 12,154 kilowatt hours. Now Uganda, on the other hand, only has 80. So that means that the United States per capita per year uses 150 times more, has 150 times more electricity consumption. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is not because I think that the United States should lower its electricity consumption. Not at all. In fact, I think that one of the primary reasons why we're in this inflationary period is because we need to dramatically increase our electricity consumption and increase our production of electricity. And we're seeing quite the rapid industrial collapse in the United States because we haven't seen an effort since the assassination of Kennedy to really drastically increase the per capita per year kilowatt hour consumption of the United States. But the main reason why I'm actually bringing out this very shocking comparison between the consumption levels of a person living in the United States versus a Ugandan is to demonstrate the very ridiculous hypocrisy that we are actually seeing come directly out of the West, and in particular the United States. So as this project has been worked on and developed, the EACOP project, East African Crude Oil Pipeline, there has been a huge movement that has emerged both online and protesting, both in Uganda and outside of Uganda, that goes by the hashtag Stop EACOP. And now you can go and you could visit the Stop EACOP website and see this for yourself, but they have a list of all of the NGOs that are a part of the Stop EACOP movement. And the list is very long, but it includes many names that you will probably recognize. And when you look into the funding sources for a lot of these movements, you will find that the majority of their funds come from places such as the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and the very notorious World Economic Forum. For instance, you see AVAS, you see Fridays for Future, which is the Greta Thunberg outlet. You see AFI-EGO, you see the World Wildlife Fund. And these are the forces, which are all almost all of them are Western NGOs who are fighting so hard to try and stop this pipeline from being built. And so even disregarding the obvious disrespect to African sovereignty that this entails, the fact that they're pouring in hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions of dollars to try to subvert public opinion, both in Uganda and outside of Uganda, to try and stop this pipeline from being built, and how that is just directly defying the democratic will of the people and their president, their sovereign president, Museveni. These environmentalists and these NGO groups are completely ignoring the very important facts about how the oil and gas industry and energy development within Uganda will substantially help both the people in Uganda and people in Africa at large and the world. So for starters, the ECOP project, when completed in 2025, will produce 210,000 barrels of oil a day. Of those barrels of oil, 60,000 will be refined in Uganda, which was a number that was selected to try and meet the demands of Africa's, and particularly Uganda's incredibly young population. Uganda actually has one of the youngest populations in the world. 70% of their population is under the age of 30. And by producing and refining these 60,000 barrels of oil a day, we will see schools for the very first time actually being lit by electricity across the country. We will see hospitals who frequently experience blackouts, which cause preventable deaths due to life-saving technology and life-saving treatments suddenly losing their access to the electricity grid due to a blackout. That will become something of the past if we see this oil and gas industry built up. And what's really dangerous about this situation and this kind of complete negligence of the facts by the environmentalists is that not only are they trying to stop this pipeline through this kind of propaganda campaign and misinformation campaign, we're starting to see some currents within the world that are pushing things even a level further. For instance, there is a professor and so-called ecologist whose name is Andre Malm, and he wrote a book titled How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And then a few weeks after he had written his book, there was already a movement to create a movie out of this book, and the movie was released. And when the movie was released, he was interviewed by Vice News. And within this interview, he explicitly advocated and stated that he thinks that the importance of reaching net zero and addressing the so-called climate crisis is becoming so important that environmentalists need to start thinking of violent measures in order to address the climate situation. And he said that, I mean, it's obvious from the book, the title of his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, what he really means by this and where he's pushing it. Furthermore, in the same interview, not but 1 or 2 minutes later after he says that, he specifically mentions ECOP as an example of a project that must not be allowed. So this is the kind of Zeus tendency that I'm speaking of. If you know the mythological story of Zeus versus Prometheus, you could see what I mean by that. And that is the tendency that we see coming from the Atlantic and coming from the so-called rules-based order. Now, I want to take a step away from that and look on the other hand at the Promethean perspective and where China and the Belt and Road fits into this. So China has for a long time taken a very active role in East African development. Since the 70s, they've been working with Tanzania, and they actually worked together in the 1970s in Tanzania to create what it was known as the Freedom Road or the Freedom Highway. I forget the exact name of it, but it was an infrastructure project that they worked on even back then with Tanzania, and it's a very important and critical piece of infrastructure. And this also has extended even to modern times, where in 2013, Xi Jinping signed a very important agreement with Tanzania to invest into Tanzanian ports, such as the port of Tanga, for instance, which is where the EACOP oil will be exported from, to develop the Tanzanian coastline into a modern economic development corridor. So this is the kind of investment that we're seeing in Tanzania, but also they've taken a very active role in the project EACOP itself. So CNOOC, which stands for the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company, they have a 28% stake in the East African crude oil pipeline project. And they also, furthermore, beyond just having Chinese national banks invest in CNOOC for this project, the Chinese University of Petroleum in 2019 signed a very important memorandum with Makerere University, which is the preeminent university in Uganda. It's located in Kampala, which is the capital. And they signed a memorandum with Makerere University as an agreement to seek for funding and begin to create a state-of-the-art petroleum laboratory. So this, they also are offering student exchange programs, staff exchange programs, and are offering scholarships for Ugandans to actually attend Makerere University. So we see, not only do we see an actual cooperation between China and Uganda on building the pipeline itself, but also on providing the education to the locals and to Ugandans to work on the project. And this has become very clear to me and my cadres in the LaRouche Youth Movement, because we had an interview and a special meeting with a very wonderful young woman. Her name is Rama Ntungo, and she is the chairperson of Makerere University's Geologic and Petroleum Society. And she was sharing with us a lot of her side of the story of EACOP and what she thinks about EACOP and this whole situation and the main things that she's fighting against. And the one thing that really stood out to me, that stood out from not only talking to her, but then later also talking to other Ugandans on Twitter Spaces, where we were discussing EACOP and the summit, the COP27 summit in Egypt, was how more and more they are realizing the absolute fraudulence of this real Malthusian green policy, to where they're going into Africa and telling these countries that you can't have and develop an oil and gas industry, while meanwhile they are doing what they want as far as their own energy policy, without taking into consideration actually helping these countries get out of energy poverty. And I think that this is something that is occurring globally. Like I said earlier, EACOP is very symbolic of what is happening globally, and what is happening in Africa is very symbolic of what is happening globally, because you have more and more of these people in the so-called developing sector or the so-called third world who are starting to see through what Putin called the empire of lies and what we see coming out of the West. To where, so when Africa comes in, they build hospitals, they build dams, they build infrastructure, they build pipelines. And when the West comes in, they build military bases. And these lies and this blatant evil is becoming more and more apparent to the world. And it's becoming clear that this is not going to last much longer. like in the metaphor I expressed earlier, when you do not allow people to contribute to growth and to contribute to development and to provide for themselves for the future, things will collapse from under your feet quite quickly. And that's why I think it is so important that in the West, we actually have a voice of reason to stand up to the leadership in our country that is so blatantly lying and holding back what must be done to move us and push us forward. And that's why it's important that we have people like Diane Sayre who are running for Senate, and what we are doing here in the LaRouche movement and what we're trying to do by building up the LaRouche youth movement. And this is critical to show Russia and China and the rest of the world that there is actually a voice of reason in the West that is willing to work together with these countries on win-win cooperation rather than war. And I am very thankful again for you to be able to have me on, Diane. And I would just like to conclude by saying that we need to join the BRI. We need to join the Belt and Road Initiative. And there is no hope for the future if Russia, China, the United States, and all other countries do not organize around principles, not just policies, but principles like Helga Zepp LaRouche laid out in her 10 principles for meeting this crisis and realizing the opportunity that actually exists within this crisis. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you also, George. So there's a few questions coming in, and I have some thoughts, but I want to go first to George and just see if you have anything you want to say in response to what Liam just presented, or anything else that's on your mind about this.
Well, I think I think Leon has done a great job, and the only thing I can say and add simply is that, you know, the Belt and Road is such an obviously positive influence in Africa. Everywhere they go, everywhere the Chinese is going, and this whole business of debt trap diplomacy just doesn't sell anymore. There's no way that anybody espousing that can be credible. There's such an overwhelming amount of information out there now. So.
And George, I had a question that came in that I thought was kind of interesting, which is someone is asking if people from Laos and Vietnam and other countries that are less prosperous than China, if China has problems with people crossing the border to come into China to get out of poverty, and how do you handle that?
Well, I think China has attracted some, but Vietnam I know of, because there, as you know, there's an imbalance between male and female in China. So there's an opportunity for women to go into China, sometimes rather nefariously, which is, you know, outside of the topic here. But I think what Laos and Vietnam are recognizing is that it pays for them to work with China. China finished building a railroad that goes to Vientiane in Laos, which has significantly improved the economic outlook of Laos, because all of a sudden, a landlocked country like Laos has connections and trade routes by way of the rail that China helped them build. Vietnam, interestingly enough, as soon as Xi Jinping concluded the People's Congress, Vietnam's party secretary was the first one to hustle over to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping, first one before German's chancellor, before Philippines president, before anyone else, just to reaffirm that Vietnam is going to be a willing and collaboration partner with China. And he saw what the Laos Railroad was doing for Laos, and he also wants to be connected and hooked up in the rail network from Vietnam as well.
Well, I think that's the thing, is no one wants to just be an oasis of prosperity, but you want to have conditions where everybody becomes prosperous, because that means that you have greater stability. The thing that really, well, there's a couple issues. One, what you said about these 3 points, and particularly the question of accountability. I think this is a big issue in the United States among Americans and in the West. And Liam, you may have thoughts on this as well from what you said, but people feel they have no means to hold their government accountable. And you're saying that the government on the higher level is holding each of the lower levels accountable. In the United States, this is virtually unimaginable. I think it works instead. We have the expression, a fish stinks from the head, that the corruption is at the top, and then everybody is forced to be corrupt on the lower and lower levels, that you never get ahead unless you're corrupt.
Well, there's no incentive to be otherwise, which is a tragedy of this country.
No incentive to not be corrupt, you mean?
Well, yeah, to be, if you're a straight shooter and you want to run for office and you start telling the American people that, getting into a war with Russia is the wrong thing to do, getting into a trade war with China is against our interests because it raises our cost of living, that candidate stand no chance of getting any financial support, any donations, and therefore any nomination for an office. That's the way the rules are run in this country, unfortunately.
I think I've run into something like that. Liam, any thoughts about?
I didn't tell you anything you didn't know. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because, like you said, it's very hard to hold anyone accountable in this country. And then furthermore, even if you want to run yourself, like Diane and you just have pointed out, well, it seems almost like to getting public office, you have to be a sellout, or you have to sell out to these parties that are sellouts. And so it's very difficult because it feels like there's no one who we can actually call for accountability, and there's no one who has any integrity. And then if you want to become in office so that you could actually be that person of integrity, you have almost zero to no chance of actually doing that.
Yeah, well, I think that's changing. I hope it is. We have to make it change. And I think it's very important that people be out in the streets. In France, they had about 1 million people out demonstrating in the last few days. I know in New York, we just had a nurses' strike of about 7,000 nurses who won. I don't know what the specific numbers are, but one of the things was patient to nurse ratios, where I heard an interview where someone said in the emergency room, people would occasionally a nurse would find him or herself with 20 patients. Can you imagine? And 8 or 10 is excessive. I don't know what they were asking for, 4 or 3. In the intensive care unit, it's supposed to be 1 nurse to 1 patient, because it's a full-time, someone in intensive care is near death, but now they're trying to have those nurses handle 2 patients. So also you get a sense here, there's no care for human life. There's no care for this principle of the general welfare, which is, after all, enshrined in our Constitution. Whereas the way this is described, and I think it's fascinating, I think it probably comes as a shock to many Americans watching this show, that the local governments are responsible for figuring out how to alleviate poverty. And it would seem that if you're in a country with 1.4 billion people, with a large land area, you would be a total idiot to take a one size fits all approach. I mean, you have so many different kinds of, cultures and ethnicities and land types, and that's really fascinating.
I like what you pointed out about the nurse strikes, and I think that this is going to be a rising trend in the United States because of also what we are seeing, what was narrowly avoided, but I don't think this saga is over, is what is happening with our railway workers. And one of the most important things, especially as they're trying to push war with China, is the way we have management and control over our supply chain. And if the railway workers go on strike, then we're going to have some serious, serious difficulties. And the railway workers, just like those nurses that you mentioned, are completely overworked. They're working seven days a week without sick days, without, if they get COVID, they still have to go to work because Berkshire Hathaway is trying to get, even though they had record profit year, they're not actually hiring more workers, and they're actually reducing the amount of workers per train.
Right, exactly. Now, one last question, George. Someone asks on this homeless question, what if people don't have family, or what if their family is abusive? Is there some other solution for them?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the a complete or accurate answer to that, but basically they would take care of these people, and they may put them up in certain shelters that it's available at that city, or put him or her in a shelter near where that person came from, so that it becomes a public ward, if you will. But one thing that it is certain is that they will not allow homeless people just lying and sleeping on the street. By the way, I forgot to at the beginning, this Sunday is Chinese New Year, so I want to wish everybody a happy Chinese New Year. It's going to be the year of the rabbit. So
great. Well, thank you.
Maybe that means we could bounce back from all of this catastrophe.
Do you want to tell us anything about the significance of the year of the rabbit?
Well, my wife is born on the year of the rabbit, but I'm not a student of these zodiac animals, so sorry, I don't have any stories to tell.
Okay, well, good. I think that's a good place to conclude our discussion. I'd like to thank both of you for participating. I also want to announce on February 19th, President's Day weekend, there's going to be a large anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C., Rage Against the War Machine. I will be speaking there. Everybody should plan to attend from wherever you are in the country and New York. And if you're interested in that, or interested in knowing more about what we're discussing, or becoming active with the LaRouche Youth Movement, you can send an email to my campaign. The website is sareforsenate.com, SAREFOR Senate.com. And thank you so much. And if we are lucky, we will be back here again next week in the new year.